Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
And Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1. Stories and scandal water, it's where you need to be. Stories and scandal water, let's pour you a cup of tea.
hello, Candy.
Hey, Ashley.
How are you today?
Cold?
It
Well,
is
not in here, just out there.
cold. It's very cold outside. We skipped fall and went straight to winter, as per usual.
Sleet always helps.
Oh, gosh.
It's nice to have a brisk wind and some wet sleet.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, you know what, though? It does set the mood because we are doing another holiday episode
Yes, we
today,
are. Hooray
although
for
this
holiday.
one is unusual.
Okay, I'm very
kind of
excited. I kind of knew the other ones that we did, but I don't know this one.
Well, I think you're going to like it. All right. But it's a little different.
Okay.
As is the warm-up, the little opener that we're going to do. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to do a little free association a la Carl Jung. You
Oh,
know.
boy.
Okay, but we promise not to psychoanalyze you based on your answers. So no pressure. As you guys know, the word association game or whatever it's called works like this. I'm going to say a word or a phrase, and I'm going to ask Ashley as quickly as she can, right off the top of her head,
Okay.
to give the first word or phrase that comes to her mind.
Okay.
All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Turkey.
Dressing.
Ghost.
Busters.
Okay.
Sorry.
Holiday tradition.
Rudolph.
Christmas.
Tree.
Charles Dickens.
That one. What's that thing? Jacob Marley.
Okay. Awesome. Do you have any idea, based on the words that I just threw at you, what our topic is going to be today?
Ghost stories.
Yep.
No, are you serious?
Christmas ghost stories.
That's awesome.
That is exactly what we're talking about today.
That's so cool. Okay, cool.
Yeah, in fact, you inspired this
I did.
because, yes, one day, I don't even know what we were talking about, what the context was, but you mentioned the song, the famous song, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, has a line in it
There'll be
about...
scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. Yes.
I've heard that song all my life, and I had never, ever registered that it talked about scary ghost stories.
Really?
No, I never thought
Christmas
about
Carol,
it.
that's the name of it. Yes, I always thought, well, maybe they mean Christmas Carol.
Right. But so why had you paid attention to that? Was it just kind of this in passing thing, or had you heard about something about that
No,
lyric
it just
before?
was a lyric that I had, like you, had absorbed for years and years. And finally one day it was sort of like, I went, oh, scary ghost stories. What would that be? And then I thought, well, maybe it means Dickens' A Christmas Carol. That's a sort of scary ghost story.
And it is. And it's going to actually play a large role in what we're going to talk about today.
Okay.
But there's more to it than that.
Okay.
I learned a lot preparing for this one. Yeah. So before we jump in, let's take a minute and think about what are some of the traditions or things, events, whatever it might be, that we associate with Christmas from a modern day perspective. So, for example, Christmas trees.
Christmas trees, wrapping presents, baking cookies.
Certain shows like Rudolph.
Yeah.
Christmas carols.
Christmas caroling. Mm-hmm. Movies, Christmas movies.
Eating dinner.
Eating dinner with family.
Shopping.
Lots of shopping.
So those are some of the things that we think about. But what I found out when I started researching this topic is that not even that long ago, Christmas looked way different in the way that people celebrated it. But a long time ago, it was unbelievably different.
Was it cooler?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it might have been a little creepy in some ways.
Is
but
it
yeah.
sort of like those Victorian Halloween costumes when you see the pictures of the kids from Victorian era in their costumes?
like
You're like,
terrifying.
what is this stuff?
Who thought this was a good idea?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, here you go. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. It turns out that telling ghost stories actually has been a part of Christmas for a long time. It is a folk custom that goes back for centuries. And it's because families would while away their winter nights with these ghost stories, these tales of spooks and monsters. In fact, I'd never known about this before either, but it even shows up in works from Shakespeare. I had to look this up. As an English teacher, I should have known, but Shakespeare lived in 1564 to 1616.
Okay.
So just to kind of put it in context. But in one of his plays, The Winter's Tale, there's a line by a character where he says, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins."
Ooh.
And then in another play, The Jew of Malta, that was written by Christopher Marlowe in either 1589 or 1590, they're not sure. But anyway, there's a line in that by a character who says, "Now I remember those old women's words, who in my wealth would tell me winter tales and speak of spirits and ghosts by night." So it was kind of a thing in winter to tell these ghost stories.
Maybe because it's cold and bitter outside and there's a nice fire, and so it's just something to do.
Kind of like the way we tell ghost stories around a campfire.
A campfire.
You know.
Your face is to the warmth, but your back is to the cold.
Yeah, I like it. Imagery. In a blog, a religious studies professor named Justin Daniels says, Christmas, as celebrated in Europe, was originally connected to the pagan winter solstice celebration and the festival known as Yule. The darkest day of the year was seen by many as a time when the dead would have particularly good access to the living.
That's interesting.
So apparently it was kind of this thing. They had
The
this
veil was a little thinner.
And so, you know, it was like it was more prevalent in their culture. They thought about it more. They told these stories more about it, apparently. But these ghost stories and this idea of telling all these tales in winter didn't take off in America the way it did in Europe. And that was thanks in part to the Pilgrims and their religious beliefs.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay. So again, putting this in context, the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620, which of course is not long after the plays that we've just talked about. And the tradition of telling ghost stories was based in folklore that was, you know, very supernatural. So the Puritans frowned upon it, and it really didn't take much hold in America, they said, because of that reason. It turns out that Oliver Cromwell was the dude who really kind of put an end to
The kibosh.
Yeah. There was an article written by Clemency Burton Hill for The Guardian, and it talks about how Cromwell caused the decline of Christmas as a holiday altogether because he was the lord and protector of England in the 17th century, and he was a Puritan. So according to this author, he said that Cromwell was, quote, on a mission to cleanse the nation of its most decadent excesses. On the top of the list was Christmas and all its festive trappings.
Interesting.
So, according to him, prior to Cromwell coming in and shutting it all down, Christmas was celebrated with a lot of the things that we enjoy now. Lots of food, decorations, singing. They would do a lot of drinking, apparently. He said that Cromwell actually banned Christmas carols.
Wow.
I know.
He was serious.
Yeah, so Christmas carols must
He
have
would
been
have fit
a part
in
of
that
it.
town in Footloose.
Yeah.
He would have.
He would have supported them.
He would have.
And apparently there was even people dressing up in costumes and as part of their celebrations, which of course Cromwell puts an end to that too.
Oh, wow.
So he shut it all down. And this continues, right? So Christmas kind of is fading. It said by the time Charles Dickens came along, which he wasn't until 1812, he died in 1870. The tradition of Christmas was fading by the time Charles Dickens was born, except it said in certain pockets in the countryside. It said that Christmas was a second-rate holiday, Easter was their main church holiday, Boxing Day actually was the main winter holiday, and Christmas was like way behind both of those.
Boxing Day is right after the day after Christmas, right?
Oh, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure it is, yeah.
Okay. It said in a different source that, here's the quote, in fact, for most people, it was still a work day. The Industrial Revolution meant fewer days off for everyone, and Christmas was considered so unimportant that no one complained.
I think back in Henry VIII's day, I read a biography on his daughter Elizabeth, and I think they exchanged gifts New Year's Day. I think that was more of a time that you celebrated and gave each other presents was New Year's instead of Christmas.
Well, I can see that. The beginning of a new year and excitement.
Because she wrote him a poem or something.
Okay. Christmas Carol came along, and it actually changed a lot of things. Not just for this Christmas ghost story tradition, but in terms of bringing back Christmas as a holiday as well.
Okay.
So it was hugely important. Something I thought was interesting was that Charles Dickens actually wrote A Christmas Carol as a statement about society. He had been out and about in the country, and he was very concerned about issues like poverty, the child labor, the lack of any kind of system to support the disabled.
Yeah.
And so he wrote, it was a book, he wrote the book really to try try to cause change.
Tiny Tim would have been the child labor kind
Absolutely.
of, and the disabled too.
And I can't remember the details, but he based Tiny Tim on a real child that he knew who was disabled and did not get help and died.
Oh,
And so that was who he based Tiny Tim on. But it said that there was a Time magazine article entitled How Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol Changed the Way the Holiday is Celebrated. It said that when Charles Dickens pitched his book to the publishers, they couldn't understand why anybody would be interested in the idea. Christmas was unimportant.
that's how unimportant it was.
Yeah. Apparently, Charles had some foresight. He had noticed that Christmas was making a little bit of a comeback because
Santa?
Actually, it said that Queen Victoria had recently married.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, the Christmas trees, they started
Yes.
using Christmas trees, and that really brought Christmas trees back into people's lives. Yeah.
Exactly. She had married the German Prince Albert, and they brought the Christmas tree over from Germany, and it brought back this idea of, oh, this festival is a time for families and celebrations. And so people were starting to think about it more. And so he was like a forerunner of that. He saw it coming, and he managed to put his book out there. The publishers were not great, though. In fact, in order to get the book published, Charles Dickens had to put in some of his own money because they wouldn't cover all the costs. He was not a fan of his publishers.
I don't blame him.
Of course, the book was published on December 19th, 1843, and it was a massive success. And I mean, we know now it's probably the most famous Christmas story of all time.
Right.
And as we've said, it is a ghost story.
Yeah.
So as we all know, here's a quick summary. It's about a miserly man named Ebenezer Scrooge, who on Christmas Eve is visited by 4 spirits. The first one is his old business partner, Jacob Marley. And then there are the ghosts of Christmas past, Christmas present, and
Christmas future.
Yeah, Christmas yet to come. And of course, through the course of these encounters, he comes to realize how his selfish, heartless attitude toward others negatively affects them, and he decides to change his ways.
Right.
Okay. Well, as luck would have it, the publication of his book, A Christmas Carol, occurred right around the same time as the invention of the commercial Christmas card.
What luck.
I thought this was fascinating. Apparently, I didn't dig into this, but it sounded like the tradition was that at Christmas time you had to write these big, long Christmas letters.
Oh,
and that was something
yeah.
that everybody did.
Okay.
And so this one fellow decided he didn't have time for that. He was too busy.
He said, just have a good holiday.
And he invented the Christmas card. And of course, everybody was like, hey, save us a lot of letter writing. We
You
love
see a
this.
need and you fill it.
Right. But with the book coming out around the same time as the Christmas card, and then it kind of coincided with these 19th century businesses who were looking for the idea of creating a new holiday because it meant money
Right.
and meant income.
Right.
So all of this together caused Christmas to kind of see a resurgence in Britain. And with it came the ghost stories because his book was so popular and it incorporated that. Other writers were in on this as well. We had people like E.F. Benson, Algernon Blackwood, J.H. Riddle, and then later in the 20th century, A.M. Barrage and M.R. James. But Charles Dickens is the guy that they give the credit for keeping this tradition of ghost stories at Christmas time alive.
He's the granddaddy of them all.
He's the one. And one source literally said that while other Victorian writers might also have been doing it, it was really Charles Dickens who popularized the notion of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve.
That is really cool.
Yeah. So one way he did it through his writing was, I didn't know this, but apparently Charles Dickens edited magazines for decades.
So he would know how to write chapters and make people want to tune in for more.
Absolutely. He knew how to do serials, but he also knew how to up the readership at the holiday time.
Okay.
He would put out these little special Christmas specials, right? So one of his magazines was Household Worlds. That one ran from 1850 to 1859. And then after 1859, his magazine was all the year round. In his Christmas publications, they would put out Christmas stories that featured, that ghostly element, not just A Christmas Carol, but also certain works, other works, like one was called The Chimes, one was called The Haunted Man, both of which also feature an unhappy man who changes his ways after visitation by a ghost.
Are those available?
Oh, I'm sure they're out there somewhere. So his publications didn't just tie to winter. They weren't just winter themed. They explicitly linked Christmas and to ghost stories, to these ghostly events. In one of his stories called The Seven Poor Travelers, which was written in 1854, he even said, straight up, Christmas Eve is the, quote, witching time for storytelling.
Oh.
Yeah. So with that in mind, Ashley, I have rounded up one of Charles Dickens' stories.
Oh, cool.
This is called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton.
That is a very specific title.
Yes, it is. It was actually written before A Christmas Carol.
Oh.
Some would say this is a precursor. I'll tell you a little bit more about it after you share with us a little excerpt.
Okay.
Now, this is Charles Dickens, so
It's a little flowery.
it's a little flowery. Be
Okay.
prepared for
Okay.
some long sentences and some big words.
Okay.
And because I know our listeners probably don't want to hear a 9-page story.
Oh, yeah.
we're just
That
gonna
looks
do
like
a-
tiny font.
We're going to do a brief excerpt.
Okay.
Okay. So I've highlighted the part that I'll have you read in your best suspenseful voice.
Oh, dear. Well,
Yeah.
is it going to be like my voice for the War of the Worlds?
You don't have to be quite so,
suspenseful?
excited. It's going to be more dramatic.
Okay.
Or, eerie. But
I don't need the rest of this, do I?
no, you don't. You only
Okay.
need that one page. Okay. So just to offer a little context to make sure that our listeners can follow you, I'll give you the lead in.
Okay.
The story is about this church sexton. And by the way, a church sexton is, here's the definition, a church officer or employee who takes care of the church property and performs related minor duties such as ringing the bell or digging graves. This particular church sexton is doing just that. He is a grumpy, horrible, miserly man who is on his way to dig a grave in the graveyard.
Okay. Well, I would not call grave digging a minor thing, but okay, we'll go with that. He's grumpy. All right. Is his name Gabriel? Mm-hmm. As Gabriel walked on and the voice drew nearer, he found it proceeded from a small boy who was hurrying along to join one of the little parties in the old street, and who, partly to keep himself company, and partly to prepare himself for the occasion, was shouting out the song at the highest pitch of his lungs. So Gabriel waited until the boy came up, and then dodged him into a corner, and rapped him over the head with his lantern 5 or 6 times to teach him to modulate his voice. And, as the boy hurried away with his hand to his head, singing quite a different sort of tune, Gabriel Grubb chuckled very heartily to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. Well, he's already mean.
Exactly.
Okay. He took off his coat, put down his lantern, and getting into the unfinished grave, worked at it for an hour or so with a right good will. But the earth was hardened with frost, and it was no very easy matter to break it up and shovel it out. And although there was a moon, it was a very young one, and shed little light upon the grave, which was in the shadow of the church. At any other time, these obstacles would have made Gabriel Grubb very moody and miserable, but he was so well pleased with having stopped the small boy's singing that he took a little heed of the scanty progress he had made, and looked down into the grave, when he had finished work for the night, with grim satisfaction. Murmuring, he gathered up his things. "Ho, ho!" laughed Gabriel Grubb, as he sat himself down on the flat tombstone, which was a favorite resting place of his, and drew forth his wicker bottle. "A coffin at Christmas! A Christmas box! Ho, ho, ho! Ho, ho, ho!" repeated a voice which sounded close behind him. Gabriel paused in some alarm, in the act of raising the wicker bottle to his lips, and looked around. The bottom of the oldest grave about him was not more still and quiet than the churchyard in the pale moonlight. Not the faintest rustle broke the profound tranquillity of the solemn scene. Sound itself appeared to be frozen up. All was so cold and still. "It was the echoes," said Gabriel Grubb, raising the bottle to his lips again. "It was not," said a deep voice. Gabriel started up and stood rooted to the spot with astonishment and terror, for his eyes rested on a form that made his blood run cold. Seated on an upright tombstone, close to him, was a strange, unearthly figure, whom Gabriel felt at once was no being of this world. His long, fantastic legs, which might have reached the ground, were cocked up, and crossed after a quaint, fantastic fashion. His sinewy arms were bare, and his hands rested on his knees.
Ooh.
Sounds like he has whatever is coming to him.
Well, before we go on, why don't we take a quick break?
Okay.
Hey, this is Josh Martin. I'm the jingle writer for the Scandal Water podcast, and I've known Ashley and Candy for quite a while, and I knew that this podcast would be every bit as good as it has been. Their passion
for theater, their passion for the cinema, the level of research and the level of detail that they give in these stories, their ability to tell the story. So it makes this podcast so great. Working with these ladies to determine what this jingle needed to sound like was such a pleasure. You can contact me at jrmartin245@gmail.com. I do a lot of that kind of stuff. If you need a jingle for your podcast, let me know. And I've also got a new album coming out this winter. It's a self-titled album that you can find anywhere that fine music is being streamed. Now that's enough from me. I think my glass is getting a little low here. So Ashley and Candy, would you guys mind to maybe pour me a little more tea?
As I said, this was a precursor. This was about, I believe, 7 years before A Christmas Carol was published. And so some think this was almost Charles Dickens playing with the idea that ended up turning into A Christmas Carol because, spoiler alert, the sexton ends up learning his lesson and becoming a different fellow because of his encounter with these goblins in this churchyard. And he is very much an Ebenezer type character at the beginning.
Does he go and apologize to that little guy?
I don't believe he ever goes and finds that little boy, but he definitely gets his comeuppance.
Good.
And learns his lesson. Okay. Back to the point. Dickens made this such a regular part. I mean, every year he was putting out these Christmas stories, and it helped to, again, not only popularize Christmas, but this tradition.
Did he call it specifically Christmas stories? Do you know? Or was it a different term?
I referenced it.
Okay.
But yeah. Dickens helped make the practice of telling scary stories at Christmas so common that a humorist named Jerome K. Jerome wrote in his 1891 collection called Told After Supper that, quote, "Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about specters. It's a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood."
Really? They would have fit right in with the true crime movement of today.
See?
It's so
Totally
wild.
normal that we're fascinated by these things.
That's it. Oh, I have an update for you. Okay, this is taking a 90-degree turn real quick. But remember when we had our first episode and we talked about why do we listen to true crime?
Yes.
Right? So this came to me afterwards. So I had this incident where I was in town somewhere and I was walking into a house of a friend and this person flew up the road and like slammed on the brakes right in front of me. And it was a woman and she was absolutely frantic. And she said, "Have you seen my dog?" And she held out her a picture on a phone or something. And I started to walk toward her car and all of a sudden in my mind it went, "Stop." And every true crime I had ever heard in my life just automatically made me literally stop in my tracks. Turns out she was a normal person. Okay. But can you think of that situation? This woman is frantic. She comes up in a van, she had a dog with her, but she said, can you help me find my dog? Here's what it looks like. And she holds out this phone. What if I had walked toward her and someone had been in that? So that was just a sidebar of that's why we listen to true crime. That is why we listen to true crime, because it saved me from a completely fine situation. But in my head, as it turns out, it was totally fine. And I looked up and she really was missing her dog. But what if she hadn't been?
Exactly.
And that's what stopped me, is just, this situation, stop. I just heard that in my head. Yes, I heard it in my head. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, back to poor old Charles Dickens. By 1868, he'd had enough. He himself decided he didn't want to do that anymore. He discontinued the Christmas publications every year, even complaining to his friend Charles Fletcher that he felt as if I had, quote, "murdered Christmas a number of years ago. Perhaps I did, and its ghost perpetually haunted me."
Wow. Yeah. So he's regretting it.
Well, he got tired of it, I think.
Yeah.
They said that other writers picked up where he left off. They continued to tell ghost stories, but here's what happened. They said that these other writers started to care more about the scare and the suspense
instead of the actual moral of the story.
That is 100% it. In fact, a writer named William Dean Howells wrote an editorial in Harper's Magazine in 1886, and he said that the ghost tradition, the Christmas ghost story tradition, had suffered from the loss of Dickens' sentimental morality. And he said, this is a quote, "The ethical intention which gave dignity to Dickens' Christmas stories of an earlier date has almost wholly disappeared."
Wow.
Yeah. So the fact that Dickens had used his stories to reaffirm these basic values, to teach lessons, to do exactly what you said. They had morals.
Yeah.
That was important. That was important to people. And so they just wanted to tell stories. One of the examples they gave was in Henry James' famous Gothic novella, The Turn of the Screw. Uh-huh. It's framed around a group of men sitting around a fire telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, but it was all about the terror. It didn't have any kind of important message to share. Another writer wrote an editorial for Harper's Magazine as well, and here's what he said. It was well once a year, if not oftener, to remind men by parable of the old simple truths, to teach them that forgiveness and charity and the endeavor for life better and purer than each has lived are the principles upon which alone the world holds together and gets forward. It was well for the comfortable and the refined to be put in mind of the savagery and suffering all round them, and to be taught, as Dickens was always teaching, that certain feelings which grace human nature, as tenderness for the sick and helpless, self-sacrifice and generosity, self-respect and manliness and womanliness, are the common heritage of the race, the direct gift of heaven, shared equally by the rich and poor.
That's lovely.
It was. Even the way they spoke
back
was
then.
Beautiful.
I
know, so eloquent.
And all I can come up with is, wow, or that's cool.
At the same time that this tradition of telling Christmas ghost stories was starting to lose its popularity, partly because, of what we've just discussed, Dickens had dropped out of it. Other people had kind of just gotten caught up in telling scary stories. Well, another thing had happened that had a huge impact on this, which was a lot of immigrants from Scotland and Ireland were moving to America, and they brought with them a new tradition called Halloween.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so Halloween started taking over as something that was associated with scary events.
Ghost stories.
Exactly. Okay. Now, it wasn't overnight. It took a long time. In fact, I was surprised at how long that transition took. There was a Good Housekeeping article that said Halloween parties weren't even really kind of a thing until the late 1800s in America, and that trick-or-treating didn't really take off until maybe 60 or so years ago in the 1950s, when Halloween became more of a national event. So Halloween did not happen overnight.
Okay.
But definitely, there was this shift was happening.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And one source said that even as late as 1915, there were still Christmas magazines that were dominated by ghost stories. So it took a while. It took a while for that to totally die out and for Halloween to kind of take over as the time for spirits and haunts and all that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So there you go, Ashley.
That is very interesting. Thank you for doing that.
I'm fascinated. I had no idea about any of this.
I didn't either.
Yeah.
Armchair psychologist.
That leads us into our armchair psychologist moment.
Okay.
Which I'm just going to ask you, why? We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but why would telling ghost stories be a thing at Christmas time?
At Christmas time? Gosh, I don't know. I thought you were going to ask me what my favorite version of A Christmas Carol is.
Well, you can answer that one too.
Probably The Muppets. Followed by Scrooged with Bill Murray. I liked that version too. Good. Oh, one reason I like the Muppets one is I think it was Michael Caine who was in that, and he said he treated it as a straight drama. And that's... He would. Yeah. Okay, so why do we tell each other ghost stories at Christmas?
I have a theory.
Oh, let me hear it.
Well, no, I want you to...
Well, maybe I can bank on it. I'm kind of going to make something up right now. Let me hear what you have to say.
Well, I think it's similar to what we've alluded to already, but I think at Christmas time, it is a time for family. Mm-hmm. You have gathered people together. I'm hoping, I'm in my mind, I see these families who are in the same house, maybe friends and relatives you haven't seen in a long time, and you don't have TV and you don't have movies.
Yeah.
And like, what would you do? Well,
try to spook each other.
Telling ghost stories is fascinating.
It is. I think that we have a natural affinity and obsession sort of with the supernatural. Mm-hmm. I think we kind of have, I'd be interested in digging into more of how supernatural the world used to be. I feel like we live in a supernatural world and we've just kind of tapped that down. But the more you dig into that, the more I think it proves itself true. That this is a more of a supernatural world than we initially think it to be.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. I do think people are fascinated by it for sure. I mean, I can remember jumping around a little bit, but I'm going back to what you said about the fire,
Yeah.
I mean, telling ghost stories around a fire was such a cool thing to do. I had a brief stint as a brownie when I was young. And I mean, like, that was my favorite thing about camping.
I guess some people really get attracted to that spooked out feeling. Like you read more scary books than I do, correct? Because you read the Stephen King stuff.
Oh, yes.
And so what do you like about those? Why do they appeal to you so much? Why does that spooky feeling appeal to you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's the adrenaline, the empathy with the characters and being able to put yourself in their shoes, yet you're totally safe.
Right.
It's like you get to experience these situations that are just terrifying or mysterious and or suspenseful, but you're cuddled up in this warm bed and you get to experience it secondhand. And it's just...
Is it sort of like living vicariously, adventurously, or it's something, but it's also something you, quote unquote, know would never really happen to you?
Well, I'm sure that knowing that you're safe and that you hope it's never going to happen to you definitely makes it much more appealing. But yeah, I think the best writers and or storytellers are the ones who make you feel like you're there and that you are in that...
Experiencing it.
You're experiencing it. You're in that story, living it with the main characters. And so that's what...
What is your favorite spooky story? Let's do some association. Let's turn them tables.
Oh my goodness.
When I say that, what was the first story that came to your head?
Well, maybe it's because you'd already said Stephen King. So
Sure,
my mind was
probably.
already there. But I mean, some of the classic Stephen Kings are just so creepy. Salem's Lot,
And what's that about?
vampires.
Ooh.
Yeah. The Stand,
And what's that about?
a pandemic that wipes out.
Oh dear.
It wipes out the world. But then there is a supernatural element. There's kind of the forces of good and evil.
Okay.
And yeah, it's an epic novel. There are so many, but it is fascinating because you just get drawn into them. And I think there is something with that adrenaline.
Yeah.
You know? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure it's something with what is it that gets released? The epinephrine or whatever that chemical
Endorphin?
is. Yes, thank you.
Endorphins.
The endorphins. I'm sure it's something to do with that.
It has to be. And I guess, like I said, it's because our lives, too, are fairly safe and predictable. And we're not going to be in these kind of adventures. So you kind of feel the adventure through them. Now, I don't know about olden times. That grave thing that we just read earlier, I hope that never happens. If it does, I would not sit there and converse with him. I would be halfway home.
100%. Well, this was a fun episode to research.
It was a really fun one. I'm glad you did that.
Well, let's end, I think, with a cheers to Charles Dickens.
Yes,
because
sir.
I knew he had a great impact on literature.
Did not realize it was a great impact on Christmas, the holiday.
Right? So, cheers to you, Mr. Charles Dickens.
Cheers to you and to sweet Tiny Tim.
This episode of Scandal Water was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown.
That's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
All music was written, composed, performed, and mixed by Josh Martin. The artwork was designed by Matt C. Adams, while our website was developed by Joshua Reith. If you like what you hear and you want to help keep the Scandal Water brewing, please go to our website, scandalwaterpodcast.com. Just click on your podcatcher of choice, then hit follow to subscribe. And while you're there, you might as well leave us a 5-star rating and review. And don't forget, it's always more fun when you share your tea with others.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers,
Or clearly professional psychologists.
Thanks for listening.